Hello, everyone, and welcome to the SISU Peak Performance Podcast. Today, we have with us Mark Jamison. Mark is an Associate Athletic Director for High Performance at Southern Illinois Edwardsville University. He's overseeing the strength and conditioning program of 14 teams. He's also the owner of High Performance Consulting and a professor of advanced techniques and concepts in strength and conditioning at the graduate level. He's a certified strength and conditioning specialist and a corrective exercise specialist. Mark, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for the intro. My title is always kind of a mouthful to say, so you did a good job saying it.
Yeah, it took me. I practiced it a couple of times before I said it, so that helped.
I always try to shorten both the title and the school name. I always try to shorten it, but
right. Yeah,
I'm doing well.
Awesome. Really happy to have you here today, Mark, to talk about the world of strength and conditioning, an area that is especially important for every athlete that is trying to reach the best version of themselves. But before we get into the strength and conditioning world, talk a little bit about the experience that you have working with athletes and coming back from an injury. I would like for you to tell us a little bit more about you, who is Mark Jamison, and your story and how you got into the strength and conditioning world.
Yeah, for sure. So I've been in actively coaching in strength and conditioning for a little over 15 years, 12 at the collegiate level. So since 2012, started at the University of Iowa, and then I moved around a little bit since then. So Eastern Washington University, Bradley University, and then I found myself here at SIUE. Prior to that, I worked for 3 years in the private sector. So I did a little bit of like high school strength and conditioning, did some personal training as well. Just kind of saw what that private sector world was like, as well as working within a physical therapy clinic. And prior to that, so kind of what got me into, this field in general, I was an athlete myself, so played football in college. I never really had that many injuries, to be honest. But we were one of the few Division III schools that had a full-time strength and conditioning coach at Central College. He did a fantastic job. And so I just kind of saw the immediate impact that someone designated to this field can have, going from high school where, we to be honest, would open up the Bigger, Faster, Stronger magazine, and whatever was in the magazine, that's kind of what our program was that day. And nobody's really kind of guiding you through, to then being with a certified strength and conditioning coach who knew how to take you through that process, who knew how to help you, from a long-term athlete development standpoint. How is he going to continue to improve our abilities over 4 years? And the impact that had was enough to where, I said, okay, I'm going to start looking into this field a little bit more in terms of exercise science. So that was my major at the time. And, I didn't quite know exactly what I wanted to get into, if it was personal training. My thought immediately was physical therapy. I did have a few injuries, never with football besides concussions. All those injuries came from, in the off season, we were playing club basketball and things like that. And I'd always roll my ankle or something like that there. But, the impact that you saw from working with a physical therapist and the athletic trainer, because you could build those relationships, those individual relationships, and just the impact that they immediately had on you, and making you feel comfortable with, where you're at and the progress you have coming back from an injury, I thought was huge. So it kind of had this balance of, I want to do some of the medical side of things as well as the performance side in terms of strength and conditioning. And we, went down essentially the route or the path of strength and conditioning coach, ultimately, because I wanted to have more of a team impact. I like being in that team atmosphere, in terms of working with, whether it was university, high school, whatever it was, just kind of being a part of that culture, and working through team settings. I like being as fully integrated with the program as much as possible. So on pitch or on field work, as well as the strength work in the weight room, as well as conditioning, kind of having a holistic approach. So that's kind of what led me more towards strength and conditioning. And then, SIUE, I've been here now 9 years. Can't really believe it's been that long. But it's, evolved quite a bit since I've been here. So when I first got here, just title was head strength and conditioning coach, small staff. Been very fortunate that, the administration around me has continued to put resources into my department, into my staff, and built that out to where we have 5 staff members now. I think a very good weight room. They're very receptive of sports science and being able to slowly integrate technology and things like that. And then built that out to, what we call the high performance model now. And I think high performance is something we'll probably get into, but can be seen in many different ways in terms of how it actually operates. But how it operates here is, I work as a strength and conditioning coach, but I only have one team that I directly oversee of the 14.
Mm-hmm.
So what I do is I oversee our sports medicine department, both internal and external. So our athletic training, as well as our physical therapy, sports science, sports nutrition, and mental performance. So from there, I can work with all of our return to play athletes. So I work individually with all those, and I kind of work as the person that helps that facilitation of true collaboration between all those departments, being able to communicate that information to the athlete, to the sport coach, and really help that progression from true rehabilitation with a physical therapist to that mid stage in the weight room to getting them back onto the court or on the field.
That's awesome, Mark. Thank you so much for sharing your way into the strength and conditioning world. I'm curious to know what made you said that you were thinking about going into the physical therapy route, right? What made you stay with the strength and conditioning?
Well, to be honest, I had a pretty good mentor that was a physical therapist and kind of just gave me the honest feedback of, if you want to be a strength and conditioning coach, first and foremost, because my thought was I could kind of cut out the middleman if I was a physical therapist, licensed physical therapist as well as a strength coach. There's not a lot of those. It's getting more common, but there's not a lot of those positions where you work as a primary strength coach in a team setting as a physical therapist. So you'd be essentially this mentor told me I'd be the most underpaid physical therapist in the country if I went that route. So he kind of just said, make that decision of, do you want to go physical therapy? Because that's kind of where the landscape is at that time, around like 2010, 2011. Or do you want to just, go all in with strength and conditioning coach? And so that's where I kind of made that decision. I knew I wanted to be a strength coach. I thought maybe I could decrease the amount of time it takes from an athlete coming to a strength coach and saying, hey, this bothers me. The ability to do a diagnostic assessment with that athlete then and there to be able to kind of create a quick intervention to keep them training or try to address some of those issues, as opposed to waiting for that appointment to happen, going to the appointment, waiting for that information to be relayed. You might miss a few days in there in terms of training and being able to help with a performance standpoint. So my thought process was, if I was a licensed PT, I could do all those things within that session and really save a lot of time for that athlete. But yeah, it just came down to, I knew I wanted to be a strength coach, and the time that it would take to go through physical therapy route. The salaries are a little bit lower for strength coaches, at least to start. So I kind of knew, okay, I got to make that decision and go all in with one of them.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that's very useful information for for someone that is listening and is thinking about going to the strength conditioning or physical therapy world. Those are important factors to take into consideration before making that decision. Also,
Yeah,
Mark,
sure.
during these 9 years that you've been at this IUE, how has been that whole transition, right? Can you talk a little bit more about the technology that you use with your athletes?
Yeah, for sure. So, obviously it came with staff first. So being able to go from 3 to 5 is really important, because, the hardest part with technology, acquiring new pieces of equipment, you have to have the manpower to be able to analyze and interpret that information. And then once you've done that, can I apply that information and make actionable interventions or changes or modifications to my program? So it started with the staff first, and been very fortunate to have phenomenal staff. While I've been here, a lot of that staff has gone on to be directors at large Division I universities, work in professional baseball, and have really long-lasting careers at high institutions. But as we slowly acquired that technology, really it comes down to, okay, do I understand what we are capable of handling right now, right? So not trying to dive all in the pool, but kind of dip our feet in a little bit first. So really it comes down to, okay, what will have the most impact? Obviously, you've got budgets and things like that can dictate some of that ultimately. But when you're looking at acquiring new technology or new pieces of equipment that will require extra man hours outside of just using that to be able to interpret that information, will it have an immediate impact on our program? And that's kind of where we started. So what are some of those specialized pieces of equipment? And to be honest, we didn't really start with a lot of technology early. We started with more the equipment side. So what has an immediate direct impact on every single student athlete every single day? So we dove really heavily into isoinertial training because we saw massive benefits decreasing across the board non-contact soft tissue injuries. We saw that decrease by over 30% when we got a lot of isoinertial devices to be able to use across all of our student athletes at a high frequency. And then we started to get, okay, that's working really well for lower extremities. Can we get some of these K-GOs? Can we get some of these K-pulleys to where we can do more rotational upper body work? Again, saw those massive benefits there. So that's where we kind of started. Okay, what are pieces of equipment that are specialized that do provide a lot of direct feedback to help us make more informed decisions, but can be used by every single student athlete. So a lot of it was isoinertial and then velocity-based training. It's not one of those things that we dictate our training off velocity-based devices and things like that. We use Elite Form system, but it's one of those things that really help us in terms of being able to provide immediate impact or feedback for the student athlete, get an idea of what their possible recovery is that day, where they're currently at, in terms of their ANS system, because there's a lot of other things that you can do to try to identify fatigue, but most of the time, a lot of those pieces of technology, you identify the fatigue after the fact. I want to be able to make sure that the devices we can use will immediately help you. So VBT can help you auto-regulate within that session, especially in season. I want to make sure we're still, improving power output, but we're not driving more and more fatigue to where you can't recover from that. Now we're not going to be able to perform in whatever sport you play. Same thing with isoinertial. I can kind of dictate the intensity based on how I'm feeling because I ultimately control the amount of force by the speed of which I'm moving it. Then we kind of branched out, okay, let's look into more true, what we call sports science. And then we got our force plates to, again, try to identify even more information in terms of jump battery, isometric strength assessments. And then we wanted to, we found good success from force plates to where we then got a force dynamometer. So now we can take a deeper dive into isolated strength assessments. We can do some of our range of motion assessments there and get even deeper with mobility training and interventions that we'd create there. And then obviously GPS and those other pieces of technology that you have as well. But for me, the biggest thing is what immediate impact can it have? Is it user friendly? Is this something that, especially with us, 2 graduate assistants on staff, that turnover rate with staff is pretty high. So is this something that from a standard operating procedure standpoint is pretty simple for anybody to step in and be able to use and have an immediate impact with their team and their athletes?
Mm-hmm. You mentioned, Mark, being able to detect that fatigue early on, right, to prevent that risk of injury during the season or during the week, during specific points during the athlete's career, right? I want to talk a little bit more about that and how you work with your team at identifying that fatigue levels, because something that I've noticed that I've changed over the past, I would say, maybe 10 years in the world of sports is that now everyone, coaches included, are trying to pay more attention about that fatigue before it happens, right? About trying to find the exact metrics that are going to allow you to say, okay, maybe this player need to take a day off today. Well, before that was seen something as, okay, you can't take any days off, right? If you take a day off, you're weak, you're not ready yet. And that actually caused some athletes to go into, that overloading that ended up increasing that risk of injury. So can you talk a little bit more about how that plays a role into your programming?
It plays a massive role. I think for us, the big thing is it depends on the team, right? So you might have a baseball or softball or more of our track and field, more of our spring sports. We get the entire fall semester and winter to be able to have a true off-season training period. So you're in that 8-hour period in collegiate sports. So really only about maybe 4 hours are sport specific. And then the other 4 hours are typically handled with strength and conditioning. So we can control a lot of those, constraints and things that can limit the amount of fatigue. But then you have that huge transition from 8 hours of activity to 20 hours. That's a massive jump in an increase in both the frequency of training and the density of training. Because practice is significantly longer, you're covering a lot more skills and different things within a single day. And you start to pull away from strength and conditioning at that point to be able to prioritize the sport. So, when that period of time happens, we have to be, very cognizant of that's going to lead to fatigue. But what does that fatigue look like? And then you also have teams like a men's soccer, women's soccer, who might not train at all in the summer with us because they're playing PDL or they're doing summer internships or whatever it is. They show up, 4 to 7 days into camp, they're already playing their first game. So we haven't had a true preseason. Our off season was 3 months ago that they finished. So you have to kind of understand that all these athletes are going to come to you at different levels of what we, identify as perceived robustness or readiness to compete. So what we have to do is get really good at, okay, what are our protocols that we're going to look at to try to identify that fatigue and be, as you mentioned, more proactive instead of waiting for that to happen. To be honest, the most important thing is getting to learn and understand your athletes on an individual basis. Because a lot of teams will do subjective questionnaires. Now, subjective questionnaires can be difficult in terms of the motivation for an athlete to complete that and take it really seriously.
Mm-hmm.
But I think if you really develop a relationship with your athletes, they take it more seriously, because you might see, okay, hey, sleep is trending in the wrong direction, mood's trending in the wrong direction. And you have a conversation with those athletes of, okay, how can I help you with maybe some of the things that you have control over, like your sleep, your nutrition, certain things like that, or recovery. How can I help you with recovery modalities, or coming in for extra recovery sessions? If you start to build that relationship, I think you can really identify just in a warm up with a team, to be honest, like before you've even touched GPS, before you've even had them jump on force plates or some of the other pieces of technology that we would use to identify fatigue. You get a pretty good idea of just their demeanor, their mood, if that's changed, how fatigued they are, or kind of where their headspace is at in terms of being able to either do the exact program you wanted that day, or be able to kind of modify or adjust whatever that training session or that plan might be. So I think that's first and foremost and most important. It is obviously difficult the more and more athletes you have to build all those relationships, but the more we can, that to me is the most exact science to be able to try to be more proactive. But what we'll use is, okay, if we're going to sprint that day, let's try to get timing gates out, because we do know from a central nervous system standpoint, if you're running or sprinting at max velocity, 95% or less of your best, you're probably in some form of a CNS fatigue state. So we might want to pull back in terms of the volume. Doesn't mean necessarily the intensity has to go away, but some of the volume needs to decrease a little bit. So timing gates are a really easy way to get that information quick, to be able to make that adjustment in real time, as opposed to waiting after the fact. GPS is a good tool, if you can set thresholds. So say I don't want to get past a certain point of XLs, decels that day, or past a certain amount of high intensity speed distance, I can make that adjustment right there. Okay, this could be a session that if we kept going could lead to, an acute increase in workload that would have negative effect. So we can kind of shut that session down a little bit earlier based on just the way that practice was going that day. And then in the weight room, obviously, that's where we use, VBT kind of helps auto-regulate the set. The weight necessarily doesn't always matter. It's the intensity, the intent that we want to drive. So it's all dictated on bar speed there. So long as we're hitting that bar speed, you might have to go up or down in weight based on kind of where you're currently at. And then the force plates, typically what we're looking at there is more the eccentric components. So is it taking you longer to produce force? Are you losing some of that force at zero velocity? So that amortization phase, so the transition from the eccentric lowering to the concentric propulsion phase, if that's taking longer and you're losing force, that's a clear indicator of fatigue. So a lot of those things we've got pre-built out as our protocols, where we really want to look at those things. And if we see a certain amount of red flags, we need to immediately make sure we're telling the sport coaches, we're telling sports medicine, we're discussing with sports nutrition, what are some of the things that we might be able to do to kind of help provide them with more nutrients or different types of recovery supplements to try to get them back on track. Because obviously we need to make some kind of a modification on our end.
That communication piece, it's super important, right? Then between departments, because right, you being the someone that oversees the whole strength and conditioning department, you touch on nutrition, you touch on recovery, you also touch on how important it is for athletes to those subjective questionnaires that comes from developing that relationship with the athletes. I'm curious to know a little bit more. Are there any challenges that come from basically trying to have everyone on the same page when it comes to the athlete readiness?
Oh, for sure. I think because that's the one thing to me that I always hear is, because I'll do a lot of interviews, obviously because we're always replacing our graduate assistants every few years, that everyone always talks about communication. You always hear people talk about communication. Communicating is not hard to do. That's just relaying information to someone. Effective communication is very difficult. And to me, effective communication is I've relayed whatever information I think is pertinent to you, to your domain. Have you received that information? And then do you understand, okay, here's what we need to do from what I've just, expressed to you in terms of the concerns I might have? And that is very difficult, especially, the more of these domains, domains being sports medicine, strength conditioning, sports nutrition, the more domains you involve, the more very specific you have to be in terms of communication. So what we did to try to mitigate any of those possible issues that you might have with cross multi-domain communication is immediately establish consistent verbiage and terminology. So there's a lot of things, I know we'll get into return to play, but being very specific on what each phase of return to play is, kind of who is a key stakeholder in each phase of that return to play. When it comes to workload monitoring, for a team, what are some of those key metrics that we look at across the board specific to each sport? If everyone knows that, it makes the communication piece a little bit easier. So most of the time, that information that you're relaying to them is actually being received, and we have the ability to at least have more informed discussions about how we might be able to make those adjustments, because you're not taking the time to kind of explain what some of those things might mean, because we've already kind of gone through that process. We do a postseason evaluation meeting with every team after the season's over, and that's all those domains evaluating each other. Here's some of the things I need from you that will help me do my job better, and that way we can kind of air some of those things out, so we know going into the next season, here's what type of information I need to do my job better. Here's how I prefer that communication be relayed to me. That piece of information right there is extremely important, because that's kind of how you get that process to work within this infrastructure to make it successful, where there's the least amount of questions, because everyone feels pretty confident about what they're supposed to do based on the information that they receive.
I think that part is super important, right? To have everyone on the same page, especially when you have to make those quick decisions that are going to affect the athlete's preparation and how they go about their week, how they go about their day-to-day, their season. So thank you for sharing those that advice. I think it is very helpful for coaches, athlete also, as far as the communication piece when it comes to having everyone on the same page. I feel like sometimes we might fall into the trap of thinking that the other person is understanding whatever is going through our mind, or that we already communicated that. So super important to have those moments where you make sure that everyone is on the same page before you make a decision. Also, Mark, something that I wanted to touch on that I think is very important for athletes is to be able to give your 100% every day, right? I know that you mentioned you had those objective questionnaires, right? But something that I've encountered multiple times with athletes is that they have good strength and conditioning programs. They had good, return to play exercise that they can do. But at the end of the day, I mean, it's the athlete's intentionality, it's the athlete attitude, what it's gonna make the difference if they do it right or they don't, right? If you have them work at 95%, during, for example, those sprints that you were mentioning before, if the athlete is only doing 60% day after day, there is no way that he can get access to those gains or access to that protection from that risk of injury.
Right. I mean, I think the biggest thing is obviously making sure the athletes understand that whatever we give you, right, is the lowest amount, like a low dosage amount, right? So we're giving you the least amount of work you need to get the highest adaptation possible. We're not just doing stuff because we want to. We're providing you whatever exercise prescription we have, whatever movements we're doing. It's what you need to be able to perform in your sport. And I think when athletes understand that, they don't feel like, okay, these guys are just trying to throw everything they can at us to make us train really hard all the time, but it's not stuff we actually need. It's just stuff they want us to do. And again, a lot of that's the open communication and transparency and building those relationships with their athletes to where they understand, okay, I might only do 6 exercises in the weight room, right? Those 6 matter. I'm not doing 12 exercises and 6 matter and the other 6 are just kind of fluff. Whatever I'm giving you, I want you to attack at 100% intensity. Now, to your point, that's not possible every single day. It would be on me as a strength coach if I continuously saw you underperform So to your sprint example of, you're well under 95%, if I kept having you do that, that's on me because I need to be able to make that modification. I should have come to you and tried to create some kind of intervention prior to that point. But the biggest component is when we do see that, what are we giving you? And I think that's where some of that, trust comes from in terms of athlete buying, but also if I tell an athlete, hey, you've continuously said in your subjective questionnaires that your sleep is poor. You're only getting 4 or 5 hours a night, but you're also not trying to go to bed until past midnight. You're only eating 2 or 3 times a day. You're not getting enough caloric intake. And I help give you the information and the resources you need because you've met with our mental performance coach. You've met with our sports nutritionist to try to help create better programs and plans for you from that standpoint. And you're not doing it. You're going to continuously not be ready to perform. And that's one of those things I think is very difficult for a lot of athletes to understand. Even if I can show you on the force plates, you're pulling, the heaviest possible weight. You're hitting max concentric peak force greater than you've ever done. You're jumping higher than you've ever jumped. You're sprinting faster than you've ever sprinted. That's just your physical robustness. That's how, physically prepared you are to perform certain tasks. You can ultimately only compete at or practice at your level of mental readiness, right? And I think that's the most important thing for a lot of our athletes to really figure out over their 4 years as a college strength or as a college athlete. You have to be a self-manager, right? You have to be aware of those things that, we're providing you the resources and the skills to improve things. We really probably only have control over maybe 3 to 4 hours out of your day. So the other 20 to 21 hours are on you. And we're giving you those resources. But if you're continuously not feeling mentally ready to perform at your highest level, it doesn't matter how strong you are. You're not going to be able to produce the strength outputs the way you would if you were more mentally ready. And if we're giving you those skills and you're not doing those skills and you're not communicating that back with us, it's hard for us to make those adjustments and modifications. And that's where you see a lot of these athletes continuously trend in the wrong direction. I can do as much recovery work as possible, but a lot of it, that's understanding what does the athlete need. And again, maybe the information I'm giving them, they're not actually receiving. So how can I change that delivery? How can I ask better questions so that we can really kind of figure out, okay, here's exactly what I need you to focus on right now to make sure you are as ready as possible, not just physically prepared.
Mm-hmm. Ask better questions. That's a really, really important topic when it comes to the communication piece. I've actually had athletes that one of the things that, they talk about during their week is, okay, the coach has told me this or has told me that, and they take it in the wrong way. And something that we talk about is to, regardless of how the coach is giving you that information, that's on the coach, right? To try to give that information in the best way, but the athlete's intention with that information, right? That's what matters. And something that we talk about a lot is, okay, just take information as objective as you can. It's not against you, it's for you. And I think that's especially important for an athlete's career because, as you said, I mean, they got to take charge of their own training. They can have as many resources as you can provide them, but it's up to them to use them. To your point with the sleep, a lot of athletes complain about not getting enough sleep. But then when you take a look at their sleeping routine, right, they're staying on their phone for 2 hours before they go to bed. Right. So they're not using the resources that are given. What is something, Mark, that you do? Let's say that you encounter an athlete that keeps having those negative subjective scores. Now it comes to the objective part too, where you can actually see that he's decreasing his performance. Can you give us an example or a story, something where you have to find a way to maybe ask better questions?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, a lot of it, to me, from what I've learned, at least, probably the last 5 or 6 years, we've been very fortunate. Lindsay Ross Stewart built a phenomenal, kind of mental performance model here. And then we've been able to continuously have staff be able to kind of continue to work in that avenue. But again, to the point of like asking better questions, a lot of it is, okay, if I've continuously had conversations with this athlete about maybe whatever they're reporting subjectively, objectively, we continue to see trends going in the wrong direction, I can continue to modify the strength conditioning program. But that's only going to be able to have, a minimal impact on that athlete if, again, a lot of those external components aren't being addressed. And maybe the information I'm trying to get across is not being received. Maybe that I've tried different avenues of asking different questions and things like that. A lot of times then, what we do is bring in those other domains, right? I've tried everything that I feel I could do. Maybe I'm missing something, or maybe again, I'm just not asking the right questions or presenting certain things in the right way. And then we bring in mental performance. Some of it is just reminding an athlete of, okay, what matters most to you? What are the things about your sport that you truly enjoy? What are the things that you aspire to do or aspire to be? Who are some of those people that you look up to in certain sports? And a lot of times I think it's easy for athletes to get caught up on the physical components of a lot of those athletes that they might aspire to be or look up to. But if you look across professional sports, most of the athletes are pretty on par with each other in terms of those physical attributes or abilities. So what separates them is typically always the external things in terms of what are they doing from a sleep, what are they doing from a nutrition standpoint, what does their mental performance training look like, what are all those different characteristics that they have that aren't something that are just given to them. And sometimes it's bringing in mental performance to be able to have those conversations with those athletes, to just remind them of those things, that, hey, just because you show up in the weight room doesn't mean things are going to happen. Just because we recommend you do something from a nutrition standpoint and you assume you don't need to do it. Those people that you aspire to be, the reason that you started to play the sport or whatever it was, to be able to get to that point and sustain that, you need to really take those things seriously. And sometimes that just kind of helps give them that motivation again. Okay. And how can we slowly build these, maybe these new things that you're going to try doing in terms of, okay, I don't currently eat vegetables. Maybe I'll eat one every other day, or I'll try to eat one every single day. That slowly builds those habits over time. So they don't think, okay, I need to just all of a sudden eat really well because I only eat McDonald's twice a day. We're not saying that, right? We're saying make really small steps and make those consistently. Do that frequently over time. That builds the habit. And then from there, we can really make, I think, pretty impactful adjustments to their lifestyle that will ultimately impact the conversations they have, the way they feel, their ability to train at a higher level. So a lot of times it's having, I think, the awareness that I can't do everything. And if I've tried a lot of things, I need to reach out and make sure we have all these other domains and we have all these other resources. Let's utilize those. And I think we see this a lot of times in return to play too, right? You might have a basketball staff that has 5 or 6 coaches. Sometimes the athlete doesn't respond best to the head coach. Sometimes they have a certain coach that they really respond well to, or maybe it's return to play, and you're trying to relay information to them that's medical information. Maybe they have a better relationship with the strength coach than they do the athletic trainer. Whoever they have the best relationship with should probably be the person that delivers a lot of that information and works with that athlete, regardless of if it's technically their domain or not, because it's that trust and that buy-in and that relationship that they have that I think will ultimately kind of drive people in the right direction.
I think that trust is particularly important, Mark, what you mentioned right there, because and I think you can literally see it from the outside. Like if you watch a practice session or a game, and when the athlete is making a mistake, for example, who is the first person that he looks? Who is the last person that they're looking to get information or feedback from? So really, really important that trust. Something, Mark, that I think too, it's important for athletes to think about, right? Is how can they take advantage of their day? How can they take ownership too of their day to day? And how at the same time can we, as sports science, in the sports science world, how can we provide that environment for them? And something that I notice when we talk specifically about freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, that whole transition, you can put athletes into buckets, right? When you come in, at least that's what I experienced too. You come in as a freshman and you literally have no idea of what's going on. You're trying to take as much information as you can. Sophomore year is a little bit better. You're figuring something out, but you're still a long way to go. And then that junior or senior year are usually when you take that whole information. Is that something that you guys and you especially with overseeing those departments? How do you go about that? About having to work with freshmen, with sophomore, with junior, that difference in as far as their level of maturity.
Yeah, we try to tier everything as much as possible. So which is easy to do in the weight room, to be able to tier your strength and conditioning program. So typically your juniors and seniors have probably built a pretty good base level of strength, and they can typically respond well to more advanced training methods. Anybody could do advanced training methods, but it's how well can you respond to that, so that you get positive adaptation. Typically, if you've had a good 2 years of training with us, we know your movement skill acquisition is spot on, so your form of technique is pretty efficient. We've been able to increase load over time from a progressive load standpoint, and you've kind of stabilized at whatever that load is. We can probably try some of these more advanced methods, right? So we would tier our juniors and seniors at a higher level, do advanced methods, probably more power development because the strength is pretty good. We'd have our middle tier of athletes where we feel their movement has improved, because to your point, we've got athletes that come in and they don't even know what a squat is, right? They don't know what a hinge pattern is. It's not something that they've done. They've just played their sport or multiple sports. So we have to teach them those things. Once they've learned how to perform that movement, they have that movement competency. Do they have the capacity to perform that over time, under minimal loads, but under extensive time under tension or frequency in terms of multiple times throughout the week, and then we can start to add load, right? So a lot of our middle tier athletes, it's pretty focused on strength. We can do a little bit more higher progressions of movement patterns because we want to increase the total tensile load being applied to the athlete. And then you have your lower tier athletes that I probably have to provide you some kind of compensation to be able to teach you how to do that movement correctly, and then slowly pull that compensation away from you. So now you have this conscious function of how I should move. Can you correctly do that movement, and then slowly add weight, right? So in the weight room, it's easy to tier that out. So we try to take that same concept with sports medicine and mental performance and sports nutrition. So for nutrition, for example, I think one of the key components that we really focus on in that early tier, our lower tier kind of 1 athletes, which is typically our freshmen, is hydration and just total energy demands. So are you eating enough calories in a day, and are you staying hydrated? And if we can focus on those 2 things and you're getting enough calories in the day, regardless of what those calories are and where they're coming from, and you're staying hydrated, that's a really, really important foundation to have built. To now, okay, in our tier 2, let's start to really focus on understanding macronutrients, right? How do I read nutrition labels? How can I cook for myself? How can I go grocery shopping? Things like that. And then kind of our higher tier, can continue to build off of that is, okay, let's take a deeper conversation of what are some of the supplements that you might need, or would help benefit you, because you've already had the education in terms of macronutrients. You feel pretty good, pretty confident about your ability to go grocery shopping, cook, meal prep for yourself, things like that. You eat frequently enough. You're staying hydrated, all those different things. Okay, now we can start to have the conversation of supplements and things like that. So, it's that tiered approach that we take with all these different things, because all of it is a baseline, understanding of the education of how I would learn something in mental performance. Very well, you can't just throw 50 skills at somebody. You have to start with, do I even understand some of these things, some of these base principles first? If I understand the base principles, now I can start to dive deeper into some of these skills that you might respond well to. So we try to take that tiered approach across all the domains, and we found really good success with that because, it's transparency and it's clarity for all of the support staff members. So all the athletic trainers, all the strength coaches, all of our sports nutritionists, we understand if you're in a certain tier or a certain age range, this is going to be kind of the primary focus. And we understand everybody's kind of in that same bucket, and it makes it just easier for us. Because you're not trying to search and go above and beyond. You know exactly where somebody's at. We'll kind of meet them where they're at.
Yeah, I just feel like you just provide basically a map for the athlete, right? Because otherwise you get so much information. I mean, nowadays everything is on social media or on the internet. You can literally find anything that you can think of, and sometimes you look at these professional athletes that might be playing at a higher level in your sport. You see them doing an exercise, you think as an athlete, okay, I'm gonna do that. But there is no, maybe you are not ready yet to do that, and that exercise that you see on social media is very particular for that player. So building those foundation skills, especially important nowadays when it comes to differentiating what you can do, if you're ready, if not. Sometimes even within the team environment too, what I've seen, it can be hard to think about your priorities. Like if you, let's say you're seeing an athlete that is, benching 315, right? And you think, wow, I can only do 200. Like that can be very
Right.
demotivating for the athlete if that athlete
Mm-hmm.
doesn't do the work of saying, okay, I can't compare myself to that player. I have to compare myself to how I was a year before, or how I was 2 weeks ago, or a month ago, so I can keep building
Yeah.
from that progression. Otherwise, you try to do what someone else is doing, and that risk of injury, it's there.
Yeah. The comparison side of things is really difficult, especially in the team sport settings. And I think depending on where you came from, right? Because in college, the transfer portal is huge now. So you might have some athletes that were previous D2 or NAI or JUCO, or they came from, another Division I university. I don't know what their training program looked like. So they have a certain expectation when they get here. I still need to make sure you have enough movement competency and the capacity to perform those exercises over time before I'm going to start to, again, increase load and then increase some of these higher demands, rate of force development, so on and so forth. So I think a lot of that is they come in and they want to compare themselves with everybody else. But I think that's where sports science can actually really help, because we try to redirect that mindset as much as possible. Don't compare yourself with everyone else in your team. It's a good thing that my teammate can bench press 315, right? So focus on that. That's a positive. Instead of seeing that as a negative, like, I need to be able to do what he's doing. Oh, it's great. I got a strong teammate. That's awesome. I'm only at 200, but I can show you were previously at 175, and I can show you the progression that we've had to get there. So I think if you use sports science to help, redirect a lot of what those comparisons would be to, okay, how can I focus on myself, the process I've gone through? That helps with goal setting. That helps with, I think, being more realistic on where you're currently at and where I want to be, as opposed to just always comparing yourself with others on the team.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that word right there, right? Mindset. How are you going about your day? How are you interpreting the things that happen to you? Are you comparing yourself to others? Are you comparing yourself to that past version of yourself to keep yourself high in motivation? It's especially important, right? When it comes to developing that best version of yourself. I know, Mark, we've talked previously, not here, but in another conversation that we had a little bit about the book Think Again by Adam Grant. And we shared some ideas about how important it is, the whole rethinking process. After you've been in the industry now for 15 plus years, you were an athlete, you were in a athletic environment basically during your whole life. Nowadays, with all the research that is out there, with all the departments that we can get information from, how important it is, the whole rethinking process for you.
Yeah, I think it's massive. And all of Adam Grant's books are phenomenal. To me, Think Again is the one that probably had the biggest impact on me in terms of how I could take a lot of the information that he talked about to my actual career. But a lot of it's like that growth mindset, right? Like the ability to want to continuously learn, to challenge myself, right? To not just assume that what I did 3 years ago is still right today. And I think what I really liked about his book that he kind of covered is as you're having conversations with your staff, whether it's in your department or across different departments, different domains, where he broke down, the 3 Ps, right? So you got the politician, the prosecutor, and the preacher. You really start to, once you've read that book, you start to pick up on those tendencies that you have, right? We're always going to have our own individual bias on a lot of different things. But if we think like a scientist, right, I think we're a little bit more aware of what our bias is going into something. We're more open to hearing other people's opinions, and then being able to challenge those opinions, but within a healthy dialogue instead of just always debating. And I think that's probably the biggest thing I've understood is, if I'm going into a meeting with an athletic trainer because we're talking about our return play athlete, and I'm going into this thinking I'm going to win this conversation, we've already all lost, right? Because at the end of the day, the student athlete's the most important thing. So how can we go into those conversations not trying to be a politician and just kind of flirt with each side of whatever the conversation is? I'm not trying to preach my point, and I'm not trying to prosecute the other person and prove where they might be wrong. Let's try to identify where we're all in the right, path, or where we're missing collectively. And then if we go into that conversation more as scientists, right, a lot of times a scientist still has personal bias when they do research articles. And you can see that in the discussion piece on the back end. But ultimately, the subjects, the methods, the information that you get from that research might be completely opposite of what they thought their hypothesis was going to be, right? It's the same for us. But the good news is, on the back side of that, if you're willing to admit that you were wrong, which again, sports science and objective information can show you that, you're getting closer to being right. And I think that's the most important thing. And a huge pickup that I got from the book was just being able to have better conversations, be more open to people in those conversations, making sure that before I even start to really try to express whatever my point is or the topic that I want to discuss, I'm going to ask them questions and get an idea of where they're coming from, what their thought is on certain things, and just understand their point of view a little bit better to be able to make sure that we're having more of a scientific conversation as opposed to, again, just having a debate. It's more dialogue based.
Mm-hmm. I think it comes down to thinking and realizing, oh, okay, am I trying to have a conversation? Am I trying to listen to the other person? Am I waiting for them to be quiet for a few seconds so I can just bring whatever is going through my mind
Right.
in that
Right.
moment? I think that book, the whole process about getting more conscientious about rethinking, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
if you go into that conversation, that team discussion, right? Just thinking that you have to bring your point across and whatever everyone is saying, it goes to, take like a second role in the discussion. You won't be open to any ideas. You're just gonna keep your own opinions, and sometimes that might be outdated, right? I think too
Mm-hmm.
it comes down to reflecting on what's the goal here, right, in those conversations. To the athlete, right? The athlete is there. We are all working for the athlete. We're trying to, increase the performance. We're trying to make them feel more comfortable. We're trying to give them those or provide that environment for them to pick up on those habits. Similar to what we were mentioning before, sometimes the athlete might have trust with someone that is not you, and that's okay. There are plenty of athletes, especially with a team, and different personalities. So yeah, it's important to have that in mind to make better decisions for their athletes. Something, Mark, that really stood out for me in that book, it's the discussion between feeling confident and competent, which I think it's
Mm-hmm.
something very interesting in any area in reality, right? Like either if you're trying to be a strength and conditioning coach, physical therapist, and you're trying to be successful at your business. In the book, Adam talks about how if we feel too confident, we were too kind of confident and we are not competent enough, we get into that quarterback chair, armchair
Yeah.
quarterback effect, yeah. Where you
Yeah.
basically, yeah, where you're feeling way too confident, but you basically have no idea what you're saying. And then there is
Right.
this other side of the equation where you might be feeling very, very competent. You've done your research, you're ready to go. You know that you can have a conversation with anyone about that specific topic, but then you don't feel confident enough, and then you get into that imposter syndrome. And he
Right.
talks in there a little bit about how to get into that sweet spot. But from your experience, Mark, I'm curious to know how do you think we can get into that sweet spot between competency and confidence?
I think it's the ability because, one thing I typically see, especially with the younger coaches, is that imposter syndrome, right? Whoever their coach was or whatever they think a coach should be based on what they see on social media, TV, whatever it is, they try to replicate that. And that might not be their natural personality or the way that is actually the more advantageous way for them to coach. You see that quite a bit. I think what really helps find that balance, again, it's really difficult for us to probably identify some of those, growth areas that we might have. So what we try to do here is, instead of just waiting till the end of the year and do a performance, evaluation or performance review, we try to do those as frequently as possible. So weekly meetings, that are relatively informal, and then at least once a semester formal. And what we do is we essentially we grade each other, we rate each other. So every coach, because it's not just me on the weight room floor, it's my other coaches. They're watching how I, interact with certain teams. They're watching the way I might coach things. They can see how the athletes are responding to me, I might not be able to see that. Typically when you're, in the job itself and the work, you've kind of got your blinders up because you're really focused on that session.
Mm-hmm.
So you're missing a lot of these different things. You don't see some of the tendencies you have. So what I found really successful is if the staff kind of comes together, and again, it's difficult. It's not easy right away. But if you're, willing to hear feedback from your colleagues on things that you might be able to improve upon, you might understand, okay, I'm very competent, but I'm not as confident in certain things. But then you hear from people, you're actually doing that really, really well. Okay, it took me hearing that from my other staff members. I had always thought maybe I'm not super confident in this area because I didn't think I did it really well, right? I understood maybe the information I was trying to relay, but I didn't feel like I was doing it right, or it was resonating really well. But you hear from your staff, no, you're actually doing that really, really well. A lot of times that is a huge motivation boost to understand, okay, I can be more confident in myself with these certain things. And then vice versa, I'm super confident, right? I might not be aware of my incompetence in certain areas, right? Because maybe nobody's ever challenged me. And then I do get challenged and I don't respond well. So sometimes it takes your peers, your colleagues to kind of tell you, hey, I think we need to improve in these, areas right here. We'll help you improve. And then once you've kind of got that, what we do is we create a player card. So same thing we would do with our athletes, where you've kind of got your performance profile of your key performance indicators. Then you kind of have your risk profile, things that we need to really improve upon. We do the same thing for us, but more from a professional development, continuing education, or just coaching standpoint. Because again, I might, even though you've made me aware of that in a conversation, I might not actively be aware I'm doing it in that training session. Right. If you're with me, we've already had that conversation. You can now make me immediately aware that I'm doing whatever that maybe that negative thing is, or I'm saying something in a certain way that again we need to change. Now that it's been open and communicated across the staff, you can help me live in that session be able to improve that. I think that's where, at least for myself and my staff, we've found a pretty good middle ground there, because there's always this auditing process. You're always being audited, but it's not like a negative thing. It's not like you're waiting to just get this performance evaluation review at the end of the year. It's continuously happening every single day. And we see that in terms of all of us getting better, being more open to be able to kind of challenge each other. And I think that's a really important thing, especially when it comes to being able to try to grow yourself professionally.
I think that's an awesome way of describing what team goals should be, right? Like everyone looking to push each other, take feedback as objectively as you can, and just having that perception that we're all trying to get better in any team. Right. I think sometimes we get too caught up into, okay, what do I need to do, and we forget to have those small moments with either a coach or a colleague or an athlete, or those 10 seconds of, hey, I like what you did the other day, or this is a really good point, the one that you made, and then bring in whatever figure you have to the floor. It's a little bit on changing that. We all are trying to get better, but let's work on that motivation a little bit before we get going, so we can have more energy going into that discussion. I want to change gears a little bit, Mark, and talk about the return to play process. For me, it is a fascinating topic. I went through 4 knee surgeries in 2 years. I tried to basically ask myself every question that I possibly could to come back, and I finally did my last year of playing soccer. And something that I struggled with it a lot during those 2 years is differentiating between when I am physically ready and when I am mentally ready. So you talked about the holistic approach when it comes to the athlete and providing the best environment for them to succeed. How do you go about giving or providing that environment for the athlete during those phases when they are fighting to come back to the field?
Right. Yeah, I think that the model that we've been able to create, again, you mentioned earlier, it's almost like a roadmap. So the protocols we've created, we have a 5-phase protocol, right? Again, it's just this overlying kind of infrastructure of how we operate, how we communicate information, the consistent terminology and verbiage that we use, the exit criteria that we use, as opposed to just only operating off timelines, things like that. But really, it's just a roadmap, right? The destination is always going to be the same. But every single athlete, regardless if it's the exact same injury, they're going to respond to surgery differently. They're going to respond to certain training stimulus differently. They might have, a certain level of robustness coming in that's going to be completely different that will help them recover earlier on, so on and so forth, right? So there's all these different individual tendencies and external components that will impact how long it might take and the process you go through. But if you've had this roadmap put together, and I really like the quote from Dwight D. Eisenhower, where he during his presidency, the big thing was infrastructure. And what he talked about is plans are worthless, but planning is everything. That's what the return to play process to me is, right? So just because you created a plan, you're never going to run that plan exactly the way that you created it. But the investigative process you went through to create that plan, you learned so much. You learned all these different contingency plans and where every single domain fits within that, to where you can make, again, really quick decisions that put the athlete in a more advantageous position moving forward. So that's where I think the protocols really help. Again, the clarity is huge, right? When an athlete is shared the exact same return to play handbook that our sports medicine team has, that their sport coach has, everybody's speaking the same language. Everybody kind of knows what to understand, kind of where we're at, what the process looks like is extremely huge. But what we've tried to do is, okay, we have so many of these different domains, making sure that every single domain is a part of every single phase, right? Almost every single student athlete that comes out of the return to play process probably exceeds their previous baseline metrics in terms of speed, power, strength, all these different things. It's the most condensed training they've ever done, but without the sport getting in the way, right? So a lot of times the weight room side of things, everything improves. But what we forget is just because they're more physically prepared doesn't mean they're ready to reintegrate back into a team practice setting, even if we've done a bunch of individual training, right? With their sport coach. They might not be ready to reintegrate back into the team setting. They might not feel like they fit in with the team. They might not, they might have all these different performance anxieties coming back in, because while I can see I'm a quote unquote better athlete, am I going to be the same player I was before, right? So we don't want to wait until that point to make sure, okay, now is when we want to start doing mental performance. We don't want to wait until, okay, we're at our highest workload to really start addressing nutrition. We're going to start that all the way from the beginning. So it's not just rehabilitation with your AT and PT. It's not just strength conditioning. We're also going to do sports nutrition and mental performance throughout the entire return to play 5-phase protocols that we have. So early on, right, a lot of times what our athletes tend to have is loss of identity, right? If you've entirely attached yourself to, I'm a basketball player, I'm a soccer player, and now that's taken away from you, especially if it's a surgery, for sure most surgeons aren't going to clear you to return to play until at least 9 months. It's probably going to be a year before I play again, right? That's a really hard thing to cope with right away. Can we immediately start addressing that, right? Can we immediately start to give you some nutrition information that helps you make sure? I think a lot of kids think I can eat less because I'm not physically active. The amount of calories your body needs to repair itself after a surgery is extremely high. It's the exact same amount of caloric intake that you probably had while you're training, if not more. So giving them that information early on and not waiting for it is really, really important, because we can kind of help, put them in the right mindset, like we spoke about before, to where a lot of the skills that we'll use from mental performance, that we'll use from sports nutrition, as we progress in terms of movements that we're going to do, intensities that we're going to do, reintegrating or adding sports skill back in, you're continuously addressing and getting them in the correct mindset for each phase. For us, exit criteria, and again, exit criteria is sports science, right? That's your objective information. That helps with goal setting, right? We know what your end goal is. You want to get back to playing. You want to get back to the same athlete you were before. That's going to be a long ways from now. That's a hard thing to cope with, right? So we want to help with that process. But if we're in phase 3 for us, IMTP and isoinertial eccentric peak power, capacity, in terms of some of the condition we're going to do, that's going to be your exit criteria. Those are those mini goals that you're focusing on, right? And they all build to that main goal. And then what are some of the mental performance skills that will help you with that, right? That help kind of make sure that maybe it's emotional regulation, because again, you're going through a lot of different things and you're going to have setbacks during that period, because that's the most difficult, probably the most extensive part of the training process, right? So, without going too deep in the entire protocol and that process, because I'm sure you have some specific questions there, the biggest thing for us was making sure that, it's not just one of those things you address towards the end stage of return to play, Mental performance is from the exact start. Sports nutrition is from the exact start. What we do is try to give the athlete and the coaches an idea of who are the key stakeholders in each phase. The strength and conditioning coach is not even a key stakeholder in that first phase. You're not training at that point, right? Especially if it's post-surgery. The key stakeholder is mental performance. The secondary key stakeholder is nutrition. The tertiary one is sports medicine, physical therapy, right? Because a lot of that early on, you're not doing a whole lot of active work. What you really can focus on at that time is nutrition and mental performance. So we let everyone know, hey, this is a huge priority and we're going to hit it from the start so that we have that foundation to build off of as we progress in our return to play protocol.
Mm-hmm. I love that sentence that you mentioned about getting ready for what's going to happen in every aspect, because it's true sometimes when we talk about injuries, for example, right? Especially important, the work that you need to do before that. So you try to avoid it as much as you can. But once that happens, to have a plan ready. And in that, 9th month injury that you have, how can you transition your goals during each phase? I think that's something that I found particularly useful with athletes, right? Before, when you were playing, the goal was, to score 3 goals or, to score a lot of points, win the game. But now is how can you win the day? How can you make sure that, as you mentioned, you hit your nutritional goals, you do your mental performance exercises, you communicate with sports science, with your coaches, so you make sure that you can just win the day, and that's what's gonna fuel your motivation. It doesn't mean that it's gonna be easy, but if you are assessing your day on if you're playing that day or not, and you're gonna be like that for 9 months, that's a long time. Those 9 months are going to feel like a long time if you're assessing your day based on those previous goals that you had before. A lot of frustration, a lot of anxiety that is going to come your way because you haven't built that mental map yet to guide yourself through it.
Right.
And I think it's very important when you mention, Mark, about just having that holistic approach where every department comes together, they have their goals, and it's basically like they have their time, right? Like it's a unit, right? In that first phase, when you have mental performance, when you have nutrition, and sometimes I think it even comes as a surprise for the athletes. I've seen that some athletes, they understand or they have they believe that they don't need to eat that much at the beginning, that they don't need to eat that much protein, that they need to cut into their calorie intake, when in reality they gotta be doing the opposite. They gotta be making sure that they're hitting that. So I think, just the fact that the athletes are having that education and they're having that awareness coming from you, coming from other departments, it's especially important during those early phases and during the whole return to play process. Something, Mark, too, that I wanted to touch on is the fear of re-injury, right? So you complete all your return to play phases, you're ready to go. Maybe you're doing that transition from an individual workout to a team workout where you have a couple of weeks before you play again, and those negative thoughts start coming in, right? What if? Those what ifs? What if I injure myself again? What's something that how do you go about addressing those fears with the athletes?
We try to, part of our exit criteria, one of the things that we have to do during that transitional period, which for us is like in our phase 4, we have you do the athlete fear avoidance questionnaire, and then we have you do the IPRRS questionnaire, and then that information goes to the mental performance coach. So we want to have an underlying idea of, are you always thinking about your injury? So every time you move, how much are you thinking about it? How scared are you to reintegrate back into some of these things that we're about to do? If you're in that mindset where you're always thinking about your limb, say it was your right knee ACL, if you're always thinking about it, if you are truly always scared that you might get reinjured, we want to know that early on, because that's going to change some of how we transition you onto the field of the court. And then from a psychological readiness standpoint, how ready are you to return to play? So maybe I don't think about my injury all the time. I'm able to kind of compartment that and focus on the training, focus on the movements or whatever it is that I'm doing. but I don't feel psychologically ready to return into the team sport setting, because sometimes it's that tactical awareness. It feels like, I'm sure you felt, with all your injuries when you went back through, some of that tactical awareness is difficult right away, right? It's not just hopping back on a bike and being able to ride the bike again. So some of those concepts we want to try to address before we even put you in those scenarios, to have an idea of, okay, how quickly can we push you? Because physically you've shown that you've got the prerequisite strength, power, speed, fitness, whatever. But if you're not mentally ready, you're not in the right state, we want to make sure that we're more cognizant of that, so our approach is a little bit different. So then what we try to do is, okay, now we understand that. That's going to dictate some of the mental performance skills that our mental performance coach will give you. And then for us, I need to know that information. The sport coach needs to know it. So as we transition you onto the field, onto the court, whatever it is, what we want to do is build your confidence as much as possible. So we always try to do whatever the drill is in a controlled setting. So we'll do that with the strength conditioning coach. We try to replicate the actual sport demand, the speed of the demand, the cognitive component, which is really, really important. So different devices like leads, racks, blades, pods, adding the individual technical skill in to try to give you some of that perceptual cognitive speed component of the skill. How well did you respond to that? The next day, was there an increase in soreness, pain, inflammation, whatever it is? If not, now we can do that in individual setting with the sport coach. Right? You've got the confidence. You know that you responded well. You know that you're able to attack it pretty well. Now let's do that with individually with the sport coach. Same thing. If you respond well, the next day, there's no increase in pain, inflammation, soreness, whatever it is. Now we can integrate that into a non-contact drill setting within the team standpoint, right? So we just slowly kind of build that confidence by really reverse engineering even just technical skills, and then sometimes reverse engineering some of the passing drills or passing patterns you might do in a team setting. We want to make sure you've got previous exposure to that before you do it in the team setting. A way that we try to track and identify if they feel, again, from a readiness standpoint, everyone's familiar with RPE. We're always going to ask RPE. That's part of the subjective wellness questionnaire. But when we're doing especially sport skills, we work off of an RPI scale, so rate of perceived intensity. And what we do is we work with all of our sport coaches. Here's the current constraints that we will have in each phase. So as we continue to progress your sports skill, whatever drill I give you, personally, I don't think telling an athlete, okay, you can do this drill, but let's do it at 50%.
Right.
What is 50%, right? These athletes don't know that. Unless you're a cross-country runner or track athlete that what speed you're running at for that 50%. A team sport athlete doesn't know what 50% is. We want to avoid that. And if I tell you you're okay to do it 50%, how would you feel from a mindset standpoint? I'm probably not super confident.
Right.
Because the trainer is already telling me you're not ready for 100%. Right. So I already started off pretty poorly. So what we do is, okay, whatever drill you get, you can attack this with 100% intensity because it falls in line with what the current constraints are in this phase. We know that you've got the prerequisite strength and physiological demands to perform this task. You should be able to do it at 100% intensity. That gives them the immediate confidence that they can attack that, right? There shouldn't be any additional fear of re-injury there. And then we ask them afterwards, okay, scale 1 to 10, 1 being you felt like you weren't operating at a high intensity at all, 10 being that's the same intensity you would operate at with that drill previous injury, prior to your injury. And if we're continuously hitting 10s, we know we're in a good path to probably progress that athlete pretty quickly. If we're not, okay, we're going to continue to hammer a lot of these individual skills. But the RPI scale for us has been really huge to give them the confidence that whatever drill I'm giving you, you can attack this with 100% intensity. And I want to make sure that you feel like you can do it at 100% intensity before we start to progress.
I mean, from that psychological standpoint, that's one of the hardest things to do is if you get used to running at your 50% during the game, you need to be running at 150% because you have so many stimulus coming at you. I mean, you are not, running in a straight line. You're doing changes of directions. They are not dictated by a coach or by lights, which can help. And I want to touch a little bit more on that training setting. But it's chaotic. You go from a controlled environment to a chaotic environment. And something that I've seen too is that it is so complicated to replicate a game situation in a practice setting, right? Like you can try to provide as many variables as you can to make it similar, but I mean, it's gonna be different. It's gonna be different. So if you continue doing, those drills at your 50%, your mind is not gonna be ready once you're back on the field.
Yep.
I mean, I understood that pretty early on, even when you're getting with a long-term injury, right? Let's say the knee. Once you are in that phase when you have to be on crutches, if you keep
Mm-hmm.
like making that false step all the time, then when you're about to get into that jogging progression, it's really difficult because your mind is like, no, this is not safe. This is not safe. So getting those
Right.
repetitions into that 50%, yeah, it's not. It's definitely not getting you ready to perform.
Right.
And
You're training people. If you do that, you're training them for a sub-maximal expression of skill.
right.
Right. So then when they do get back in the team setting or a true competition, they're only prepared to operate at that 50%, because that's what their nervous system, that's what their body thinks, this is all I'm capable of doing because that's what I've been training. You're training them for that. So we want to try to avoid that as much as humanly possible.
Yeah, and something to Mark that I think it's very beneficial when it comes to that mindset and that psychological standpoint. Giving the athlete those external cues. You mentioned the technology with the lights when it comes to those changes of directions. When you are going through that phase of what ifs scenarios, it usually comes because you're thinking too internally, right? You're focusing on the sensations that you have. You're thinking on the level of tightness that you have in those muscles, and your focus is there. So can you touch a little bit on those difference between those internal and external factors, and how can that benefit the athlete during that return to play phase?
Yeah. I mean, having an internal awareness is really important. And again, so long as we've kind of been uh, discussing this and going through the educational process of that throughout the whole return to play protocol, that's really important, because a lot of those athletes that come out of the return to play process uh, become good self-managers, right? And it doesn't mean I want you to focus on, if it was my knee, I want you to focus on your quads while you're doing this drill, right? Early on, strength patterns, yes, because I want to make sure that we're eliciting the response we want to elicit. I don't want you to think about that when we're doing dynamic sport-specific movement. But if you're good with your internal awareness, it does help pre-session, right? Hey, I feel like I'm a little tight today. All right, before we get started, right, let's remember some of the things that we did early that got you to where you felt like I was warm, I was activated, I was ready to train today, and make sure those things don't leave the program, right? So I think some of that internal awareness is good, as long as it makes them aware of, okay, I might need an extra 10 minutes to warm up today, just based on how I'm feeling. But they know I can still attack today. I can still, to your point, win the day and have a successful practice. But I'm a little bit more aware of what I need to do to be ready today. Might be a little more than it was the day before. The external cues where we're trying to really address there is, there's that difference between change of direction ability and agility. Right? Change of direction is what we essentially do in strength conditioning the vast majority of our time. We want to teach you the acceleration, deceleration, maneuverability, multi-directional speed, biomechanics, right? So where should my foot be in relationship to my center mass? How should I decelerate? What should my trunk do while I'm redirecting or changing direction, things like that. Those are all predetermined cone drills and things like that. We want to make sure you have the ability to brake. We want to make sure you have the ability to accelerate at a high rate, that you can do that frequently and repetitively. But that doesn't really address the cognitive component, right? That's really only one hemisphere of the brain. That's just you focused on that specific task, right? Which is very easy to do. Even if you add, say it's soccer and you add a soccer ball to that, it's still a very predetermined drill. So it's not super challenging, right? From a sensory motor standpoint. What we want to do is from an external cue standpoint, which is where like the leads react and blaze pods and things like that come into play. Maybe you're not quite ready yet, or we don't have the resources to provide you with this, peripheral vision and depth perception of multiple players to have to make an adjustment of your movement based on what they're doing. We can still kind of provide that agility-based component with the lights. So, agility for the most part is, that's just perception. That's peripheral vision demands. That's, pattern recognition, so on and so forth. Essentially, you're provided with a stimulus, which is a light. And then you have this latency phase. The latency phase is you deciding which movement is the most advantageous to perform the task I need to perform, right? The movement selection you create, that's what we trained with change of direction abilities. So what we're trying to do is decrease that latency phase. So you're provided with the stimulus, you got that light, I need to go to that light. but I also added some kind of technical component. So I'm either dribbling, I'm getting a pass off, I'm taking a shot, whatever it is. Now I have to think about a lot of those different components, right? But still perform the task at a high rate. Those are really important to introduce as early as we possibly can. Because again, when I'm in a team setting, it's not just me and a defender, right? It's me, a defender. It's also probably 4 or 5 other people, right?
Yep.
And I'm paying attention to if I have the ball, what the defender's doing on me. But then I'm also trying to have an awareness of where's my teammate going? What channel are they taking? What space are they trying to fill? So that I can make the next movement decision while I'm in the current movement that I'm doing, right? And that sensory motor overload is typically where most athletes kind of fail initially when they return to their sport. They're super fit and they'll tell you, hey, I feel more fit than I've ever felt. 10 minutes into practice, they're shot. They're just done. Cognitively, they're just overloaded, right? There's just too much information to process. So it makes their legs feel really heavy and all those things, right? We want to try to avoid that because then that's going to decrease, obviously, their confidence. That increases their performance anxiety. We want to try to address those things early on, provide them with as much of that stimulus as we can to where they feel more confident, and it's less cognitive overload right away when they reintegrate back into practice.
Example on the difference between that the cognitive capacity that you have in a controlled environment, and then how your body is going to react when is that in that chaotic environment. I remember once when it was actually the last phase that I had before I returned to play, and we had to do an attacking drill. It was an attacking and defensive piece, right? So I was on the left side on the field, and we were doing a 4 before going into the goal, and then we had to come back, right, to do a couple of sprints back. And I remember when I made the attack, I look back and I just couldn't run. I couldn't run, and one of my teammates came and say, like, what's going on? Like, are you okay? And I remember, like, I don't know why, but I can't. And I experienced that feeling of frustration because I was like, man, I can't. I used to do these, 10 repetitions. I was feeling completely fit. I could do them over and over again. And now that I'm back again, I mean, I need to take a break. I couldn't even go back, right, in that moment. Right. And that frustration for athletes, I think it's sometimes it takes a toll during those moments. So again, having those resources and having that ability to, be aware of where you are in that moment, those goals, but also be communicating with, your teammates, your coaches on how you are doing that moment it's definitely very, very useful. Because the next action, what you don't want to do is getting into, that overtraining or sending those signals to your brain that, okay, I'm not fitting that. It's about, keep telling yourself, I'm not ready yet. Right, like that jet component. Also, Mark, something that I wanted to touch on is how does an athlete that has no idea of strength and conditioning, right? It's the first time that they're hearing about it. It's the first time that I hear about nutrition, recovery. We're working with an athlete that just came in and it is very new to the sport. Maybe it's in that high school age or getting ready to transition from high school to college. What would be some of the priorities that you will have for an athlete that is coming into the high performance world?
I mean, the big thing is, again, like the mindset, right? Just, trying to understand that, okay, you haven't had exposure to any of these components before. All of these are for you. It's to benefit you as much as possible. So, I think it's easy sometimes for people to see it as like a punishment kind of thing or something that they have to do. To try to get them in the mindset of it's something you get to do. This is something that will ultimately benefit you, make you a better athlete coming out of this. Again, make you a better self-manager, more aware of your movement, more aware of how your body feels, more aware of how I respond when I eat certain foods so I can make those adjustments, right? All these different things that are a huge benefit for them. Just trying to get them in that right mindset of, this is all for you, right? And I think what really helps is, especially if it's return to play, you ultimately dictate the pace and the speed at which we move, right? And that's why we use an exit criteria approach and not a landmark approach. Landmarks will just tell you randomly at 3 months you can do this, at 6 months you can do this, at 9 months you can do this. For some athletes, that's terrifying, right? Because they're like, I got to run in 3 months, right? And we're only maybe 4 weeks in, and they're like, God, I barely just got my knee flexion back. Like, everything still feels tight. It still hurts when I do things. Like, for them, they're like, God, I'm never going to be ready for that. we don't put them in that mindset. We tell them, we will work at your pace, right? We work as quickly as you're ready to work. So if you're somebody who has trained previously in the past, you're probably going to be pretty confident with the strength and conditioning, early rehab side of things. Maybe the sport side, reintegrating back, that's where you struggle. If you're an athlete that's never had that, you're going to be terrified to lift weights. Right? So the first, 3 months for you is going to be one of those areas that, hey, don't worry about how quickly you're going to get to be able to do things, right? Again, the end goal is not going to change. How we get there is completely dictated on you. And we try to give them that information as early as we possibly can and show them, we take them again through our handbook, show them exactly what we're going to do, what the process looks like, what are the things that we need to see you be able to do before we can start to do something else. And I think that does kind of help, redirect that mindset to, again, I feel like I have control over this situation, right? I couldn't control the injury. There's a lot of things they don't feel like they have control over. If they feel like they've got more control with their own return to play process, I feel like that helps that motivation really, really early on. And that makes them more receptive to us. It makes them trust the process a little more and makes them more open to, again, more transparent conversations where I feel like as a coach, if I've built that relationship, we can have pretty in-depth conversations where I can make some of those modifications just based on the mood you're kind of coming in with or kind of what you're telling me, how you feel that day.
Mm-hmm. The caring part, super, super important when it comes to working with athletes. I know, Mark, that you have been exposed to athletes from all over the world, right? Different cultures, different personalities. How have you been approaching that when it comes to dealing with players that are different from your own culture?
Again, a lot of it's just like the personal relationship, right? Building that. But yeah, definitely. Language barrier is always difficult, right? So
You told me.
There's players that, right. There's players I've had from Spain that I don't think have a word for pain that's different than soreness. Right. So kind of understanding that they might always say they're in pain. How can I get them to understand what pain is and what soreness is? Because soreness is to be expected as you start that early loading progression, right? Every time you try to push that progressive overload, there's going to be some form of soreness. So sometimes that language barrier makes it really difficult because they're always just telling you they're always in pain. But then you watch them do something and they're doing it really, really well, and it doesn't look like they're in pain. So the language barrier does make it difficult. But we try as much as we can to, again, if it is a pain scale, just like when you're a kid and you go into the doctor's office and we have smiley faces and stuff, that does really help, right? Try to really just simplify the message as much as possible because anytime they meet with the doctor, it's super confusing. It's overwhelming. They're using words that you don't, especially if English isn't your first language or something, and they're saying medical words. Mm-hmm. I barely know half the medical words. So for them, it's extremely intimidating and they're just kind of scared to that process. So we try to simplify it as much as we possibly can. And again, for them, a lot of it is, maybe you've done some form of training, right? Some athletes have done a lot of bands and bungees and resistance kind of training there, but not as much weights. I want to make them feel confident and comfortable early on. So if we can at least get to that point where you've let me know, okay, here's what my previous training experience is, I'm going to try to make that a pretty big bulk of what we start with early on. So you feel really comfortable. Because if I can get you to feel comfortable, now you can kind of build that trust. And now I'm going to add a kettlebell in. I'm going to add a couple dumbbells, barbell, the isoinertial training, right? Some of those more advanced methods, you feel more comfortable with it because we kind of went back to what you're used to doing. So it's definitely a difficult thing, but I think it's that personal relationship that you have and then just trying to simplify everything as much as humanly possible. Mm-hmm. And try not to get too deep into the medical kind of terminology rabbit hole that you can get into.
Mm-hmm. It can definitely feel overwhelming. I mean, again, they're getting exposed to a lot of information. So having someone to simplify that and building good ways of communication, it helps a lot. It helps you feel more confident. It helps you feel more motivated, and it helps you create that map that you can go through. A question mark that I always have for everyone that I bring to the podcast towards the end is based on everything that you've lived so far, right? The position where you are today, all the things that you've been through. If you could go back and talk to your past self, what would be 2 pieces of advice that you will give yourself?
To be honest, to kind of go back to Adam Grant's, right, like competent and being confident, I would probably tell my previous self, it's good to be confident, but the competence is understanding that you don't know a lot of things. And I think when you're really young, like when I was doing certain internships or like early jobs, you almost try to bullshit your way through some things because you don't want to admit, I don't know what you're talking about, or I don't exactly know how to respond to this situation. And that sets you up for failure. Eventually you'll learn, right? Ideally, what we do with our athletes isn't trial and error. And there's all these errors, and then I finally learn. So I think going back, it would be as open as humanly possible. If you're in an internship and maybe you don't know bioenergetics very well, you're very familiar and comfortable in the weight room, feel super competent there, but you don't with bioenergetics. And whoever your supervisor is or the coach that you're with starts diving deep, let them know right away, hey, I'm not following you. I don't feel like my knowledge is where it needs to be to have this conversation. What are some resources that you would recommend or that you have that you could give me to help me understand this a little bit more so we could have a better actual discussion about this? Because anything you say right now, it's not going to be retained because I don't even know the words you're using. Having really that open, just being honest with yourself and being open enough to tell your mentors that. Every time I've had interns tell me that, those tend to be the best interns that we ever have. Those are the ones that go on to have really high level successful jobs because they truly learn. Where I think if you're just overconfident and you think that's all I need to do is portray this high level of confidence, but you're never willing to say I don't know something, you're never truly going to learn it then, right? And at some point, it's not hard for people to pick up on you don't know what you're talking about. And that's not a good thing. So that's probably what I'd go back to is don't wait until a certain point in my career to finally realize that early on. Admit to yourself, I don't know something, and ask those questions early on and admit that to people because a good mentor is going to want to help you if you say, I don't know what you're talking about right now. I'm going to want to help you. I'm going to want to give you those resources and make sure that you fully understand that. And that's a huge thing I think that I see with a lot of our young interns and young people in the field is they're competent in some areas, but not all areas, but they're not willing to admit that, which is only holding them back from truly learning a lot of things that they need to understand.
I think that's an awesome piece of advice, Mark. You actually remind me of a conversation that I had with a very good friend of mine that it's also very interesting into the whole psychology world, and something that we tend to do when we are in a stressful situation and maybe we are not competent enough, right? To your point, we unconsciously trying to make ourselves better than when we actually are. And I think I was discussing with him. I think it's because we are more worried about other people's perception of our ability than to actually get immersed into the journey that Adam Grant talks about in the book of I'm getting ready for the next 5, 10, 15 years of my life, right? Like it's not important for me to portray myself as very confident right now. What is important for that future version of myself is to acquire as much knowledge as I can, be truthful to myself, and just try to be honest and get a little bit better than they. That's all. But yeah, I think that's an awesome piece of advice, Mark. Thank you for that. Well, Mark, we're getting close to the end. I just wanted to thank you one more time for being here, sharing all that knowledge about how athletes can use more resources when it comes to strength and conditioning, nutrition, recovery. We touch a lot into that whole return to play process, which is especially difficult for athletes to go through once they experience, especially those long-term injuries. But yeah, I think this conversation can help a lot of coaches, players getting more invested into the strength and conditioning world and sports science in general. We touch on that communication piece when it comes to managing teams, which is particularly important to be successful in a team environment. And I love your holistic approach when it comes to working with athletes. So thank you.
Of course, yeah, I appreciate that, and thanks for having me on. Anytime I think I get to talk about what we do here, which I think is pretty special, is always important. And then podcasts like you're putting on, I think is really, really important because, the more people see this cross-domain conversation and discussion piece, with a high level mental performance coach as yourself and a strength and conditioning coach, like that should be the norm, not always just strength coaches talking to strength coaches. So I love what you're putting on here and appreciate you having me on.
100%. I appreciate that, Mark.